The sun began to set over the vast Arizona mountains, casting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. Ethan Walker, a 37-year-old war veteran, walked slowly down the dusty path toward the small town animal shelter. His worn boots hit the pavement with each step, a constant reminder of the weight of the journey he had been through. Not just in the past, but every day since he had left the army 2 years ago. Though Ethan had tried many things to fill the empty space inside him, nothing seemed to help. He had been struggling to cope with the trauma of post-war life, searching for something that would bring him peace. Max, his loyal German shepherd, had been his companion in the darkest of times, standing by him through grueling missions, offering comfort in ways no one else could. But after an injury on the field, Max was forced into retirement, and that too left a gaping hole in Ethan's heart. The shelter was a modest place on the outskirts of Tucson, with rusty fences and makeshift dog houses. The air smelled of disinfectant mixed with the sounds of excited barking from the dogs in their cages. Ethan walked through the narrow aisles, each step deliberate and slow as he observed the dogs carefully. Some barked and wagged their tails in an attempt to catch his attention, while others sat quietly, watching him with eyes that seemed full of melancholy. However, none of these dogs seemed to have that special spark that Max had once shared with him. He was about to turn away, feeling a sense of defeat when a shelter worker approached him. "Mr. Walker, we have a German shepherd in the back that might interest you," she said. Her voice was gentle, yet hopeful. "He came in a few weeks ago, but he's a bit special." "German shepherd?" Ethan looked up, surprised. It had been a long time since he had been around one, and the thought of meeting another dog like Max stirred something in his chest. The worker led him to a secluded area of the shelter, and there, lying in the farthest corner of a cage, was a large German shepherd. His coat was black and tan, but his posture was stiff, and there was a weariness in his eyes. Despite his exhaustion, something stirred in Ethan's heart, and he felt his pulse quicken. "Max," he whispered softly, almost unable to believe his own eyes. The dog slowly raised his head, staring at him with vacant eyes. He showed no recognition, no excitement, no wagging tail, just a distant, empty stare. It was as if Max didn't know him at all. The moment hit Ethan like a wave, and he took a step back, his chest tightening with pain. "He doesn't recognize me," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible as his heart sank. For a few moments, he stood there, staring at the dog that had once been his best friend, his partner, on the battlefield. Memories of the battles they fought together, the bond they shared, flooded his mind, but none of it seemed to matter now. The dog, Max, seemed like a stranger. The years of war, the trauma, the silence, it all seemed to have erased their connection. But even in the face of this loss, something inside Ethan refused to give up. He couldn't walk away just yet. He couldn't leave this version of Max behind like this. "Would you like to spend some time with him?" the shelter worker asked softly. "We can take him to the play yard. It might help him open up." Without a second thought, Ethan nodded, his resolve firming. He wasn't going to give up on his old friend so easily. The worker opened the cage, and together they led Max to the small play area outside. The setting sun cast long shadows on the ground, but the scene wasn't much different than the one in the shelter. Max kept his distance, sniffing the air but avoiding any direct interaction. His body was tense, and he didn't look at Ethan. Ethan watched every movement, trying to understand what was going on inside Max's mind. He knew the dog wasn't the same as before. He could see it in the way the dog carried himself. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper. Something Ethan recognized all too well: trauma. They both had their scars, both emotional and physical, and somehow, they both needed each other. But it wasn't going to be easy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan made up his mind. He wasn't going to let Max stay like this, trapped in his pain. "I'm taking him home," Ethan said firmly, looking at the shelter worker with a sense of determination. "No matter how long it takes, I'll bring him back." And so, Ethan set off with Max in his truck, driving home to a place that now felt like the beginning of a new chapter. As the truck rumbled through the darkening streets of Tucson, a quiet sense of hope began to grow in Ethan's heart. This journey wasn't just about saving Max, it was about saving himself. The drive to Ethan Walker's small house on the outskirts of Tucson Arizona was quiet. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of the truck as they bumped along the uneven road. Max lay in the back of the truck, his body stiff and tense, eyes fixed on the world outside the window. He kept his distance from Ethan, as if unsure whether to trust him, the man who had once been his partner, but who now felt like a stranger. Ethan stole glances at the rearview mirror, watching the dog's uneasy posture. His heart ached as he remembered the way Max used to be, the way he had been full of energy. Always alert, always by his side, ready to face whatever dangers the world threw at them. But now, Max was a shadow of the dog he once knew, and Ethan felt the weight of that loss pressing down on him. When they arrived at the house, Ethan parked the truck near the entrance of his property, a modest piece of land surrounded by a large yard and a few scattered trees. The house was simple, built with a rustic charm, but it felt empty, just like Ethan did. He opened the truck door and called softly to Max, but the dog hesitated. It took a few moments, but slowly, Max stepped out of the truck, his movements deliberate and cautious, as if assessing every sound and scent in his new surroundings. "Come on, buddy," Ethan said gently, trying to keep his voice light. "This is your new home." Max moved slowly toward the front door, sniffing the air, eyes darting around as if expecting something to jump out at him. He was on edge, his body tense, every movement cautious. Ethan opened the door, stepping aside to let the dog enter. But Max lingered in the entryway, unsure of what to do next. "This is your spot, Max," Ethan said, pointing to a corner of the living room where he had set up a new dog bed. Food and water bowls, along with a few toys. He wanted to make the space feel as comfortable as possible. But Max only stood there, motionless, his gaze fixed on something distant. Ethan let out a soft sigh, frustration creeping into his chest. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but part of him had hoped that the familiarity of the house would trigger something in Max, something that would break through the wall of trauma the dog had built around himself. But instead, the dog stood there, silently, as if uncertain of where he belonged. As Ethan began preparing something to eat, his mind wandered to the days when Max had been his constant companion. He remembered the long hours in the field, the training sessions where they learned to trust each other, and the dangerous missions where Max had saved his life more times than he could count. But that was all in the past now. The bond they had shared seemed to have vanished, replaced by an unfamiliar distance. "I know how you feel, buddy," Ethan muttered, his voice barely a whisper as he glanced at Max, who was still standing motionless in the corner. "I feel the same way. Lost." That night, Ethan left the bedroom door open, hoping that Max might feel safe enough to come closer. But when the lights went out, he heard the soft sound of paws on the floor. Max didn't come into the room, but instead lay down near the door, keeping a safe distance. Ethan smiled softly in the dark. It was a small step, but to him, it felt like the beginning of something bigger, something that might slowly bring them back together. The next morning, Ethan woke up to the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. He turned to find Max sitting near the door, his ears perked, silently watching him. For a moment, Ethan felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, something familiar was returning to the dog's mind. "Good morning, Max," Ethan said, stretching his arms and forcing a smile. But Max didn't respond. The German Shepherd only looked away and walked slowly back to the corner of the room where he had spent the night. Ethan watched him with a heavy heart, but he knew that the journey to rebuild their bond would take time. Throughout the day, Ethan tried to interact with Max, throwing a tennis ball toward him, but the dog didn't react. He placed a bowl of fresh food beside him, but Max only approached it after Ethan left the room. Every attempt at closeness was met with cold silence, and Ethan could feel the weight of rejection. But he understood. It wasn't just rejection, it was fear, distrust, and maybe even pain. That afternoon, Ethan decided to try something different. He rummaged through a box in the closet and found an old military vest. The same vest he had worn during their missions together. He brought it to the backyard and showed it to Max, hoping that the familiar scent of sand, sweat, and the battlefield might trigger something in the dog's memory. "Let's see if you remember this, boy," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking slightly as he tossed the vest to the ground. Max approached it cautiously, sniffing the fabric. For a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw something in the dog's eyes, a flicker of recognition. But then, Max pulled back, retreating with his tail low. Ethan sighed, feeling the hope that had risen fade away. But he didn't give up. He knew that rebuilding their bond wouldn't be easy. But he was willing to keep trying. As the day ended and the stars appeared in the sky, Ethan sat on the porch, watching Max lying in the backyard, his eyes fixed on the stars. It was a quiet moment, a chance for both of them to reflect on the journey ahead. Ethan wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't give up on the dog who had once been his partner, his best friend. The days that followed were filled with slow, deliberate progress. Ethan Walker was patient, taking small steps every day to help Max regain trust. The house, though modest and quiet, had become a place of healing, not just for the dog, but for Ethan too. Both of them were carrying burdens, one of war, the other of abandonment, but here, in this simple home in Tucson, they were beginning to heal together. One morning, as Ethan prepared breakfast in the kitchen, he noticed Max sitting near the living room window, watching the outside world intently. The dog's gaze was distant, but there was something different about it today. Ethan could almost sense that Max was processing something, trying to remember who he used to be. The old military vest from their days together still lay on the ground, and Max had shown more curiosity than he ever had before. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said softly, wiping his hands on a dish towel as he approached. "Max, you okay?" The dog looked at him, his expression still unsure but with a slight shift. There was a moment, just a brief one, when their eyes locked, and Ethan saw the faintest flicker of recognition. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Ethan's heart skip a beat. For the first time in weeks, the weight of the silence in the house felt a little lighter. Maybe it wasn't just Max who needed time to heal, maybe Ethan did too. The trauma from the battlefield had left scars, both visible and invisible, and he couldn't help but wonder if Max was carrying the same pain. Later that day, Ethan decided to take a step further. He grabbed the familiar military whistle that he had used countless times to command Max during missions. It had been years, but he knew that the sound of that whistle might be a catalyst. Max had always responded to it, quick, sharp, and full of determination. But this time, the world was different. He stepped into the backyard, with the whistle around his neck, and Max stood watching from a distance. Ethan raised the whistle to his lips, took a deep breath, and blew two sharp, quick blasts. The sound echoed through the yard, cutting through the heavy silence of the morning. For a moment, Max didn't move. Then, his ears perked up. He turned his head, his body rigid, as if he were evaluating the sound. The old, familiar sound had reached him. Ethan waited, hoping, praying that something, anything, would click. "Come on, boy," Ethan said, his voice calm but filled with an urgency that betrayed his quiet hope. "Come on, Max, we got this." But Max hesitated. He took a few tentative steps, then stopped, as if unsure of himself. His body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the remnants of memories that he couldn't quite grasp. For a moment, Ethan felt the old connection between them, like a bridge being built, piece by piece. That evening, Ethan sat on the couch, the old military whistle still hanging from his neck. Max had joined him, lying down beside him for the first time in weeks. The dog had made no attempt to nuzzle or seek affection, but the proximity alone felt like progress. Ethan watched Max, his eyes soft, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not going anywhere, partner," Ethan whispered to the dog, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me before, and I'm not giving up on you now." The next day, Ethan decided to try something he had avoided until now, a walk. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Max had always been nervous on a leash, especially after his time in the military. But Ethan believed in the bond they had shared, and if they were going to move forward, they needed to face the world together. He opened the front door, a leash in hand, and motioned for Max to come over. At first, the dog stood still, watching him warily. Ethan knelt down, holding the leash gently. "Come on, buddy," he coaxed. "Let's go outside. It's just us. No threats. Just you and me." After a moment's hesitation, Max approached, his body stiff but his eyes softer than they had been in days. He stood by Ethan, allowing him to attach the leash. They stepped out onto the yard, and Max sniffed the air, every sense alert. It was the same world, But it felt different now. They walked together, side by side, down the familiar path that Ethan had walked alone for so long. The weight of Max's presence beside him felt comforting, even if the dog still kept his distance. It was progress, small steps, that's all they needed. As they neared the edge of the property, a sudden sound caught Max's attention. A squirrel darted across the yard, and for a brief moment, Max moved toward it, his instincts kicking in, but then, just as quickly, he stopped, his tail lowered slightly, and he returned to Ethan's side, looking up at him. "That's it, boy," Ethan murmured. "You got it, you're still in there." The day ended quietly, but there was something in the air that felt different. Ethan knew they were a long way from the days when Max had been his loyal partner, ready to tackle anything that came their way. But he also knew that the foundation for something new was being built. With patience, love, and trust, they would find their way back to each other. And this time, they would face the world together, as partners once more. The days slowly stretched into weeks. And with each passing day, the bond between Ethan Walker and Max deepened. The quiet moments in their home in Tucson, Arizona, once filled with tension and uncertainty, were now becoming a place of peace. Though it was a peace hard-earned, Max was still cautious, still carrying the invisible scars of his past. But there was something different now. They had crossed a threshold, and together they were navigating the path to healing. One crisp morning, Ethan woke to find the house bathed in soft sunlight, spilling through the windows and onto the hardwood floors. He stretched, yawning, and looked over at the corner where Max usually lay. The dog was still asleep, curled up on the bed, his body more relaxed than it had been when he first arrived. A small smile tugged at Ethan's lips as he quietly went about preparing breakfast, making sure not to disturb the calm that had settled over their lives. As Ethan moved through the kitchen, he could hear Max's soft, rhythmic breathing, the kind of breath that spoke of a deeper sense of safety. The dog had stopped flinching every time a door creaked or a loud noise startled him. It was a small change, but it was enough to remind Ethan how far they had come. After breakfast, Ethan walked outside with Max. The air was cool, and the sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting shadows from the trees that gently swayed in the morning breeze. They made their way to the back of the house, where Ethan had set up a small area in the yard, a patch of grass where they could practice some of the old routines that once felt natural. Today, however, was different. Today, Ethan had a plan. He was going to bring out the old military vest, the same one he had worn during their missions in the field. It had been packed away in the back of his closet for years. But today it felt like the right time to bring it out. He knew that Max had responded to the smell of that vest before. And maybe, just maybe, it would trigger a memory that would bring them closer. Ethan opened the shed door and pulled out the worn vest, holding it up to his chest for a moment before walking back to Max. The dog was sniffing the air, his ears twitching at the sound of his owner's footsteps. "Ready, buddy?" Ethan asked, holding up the vest. "Max, do you remember this?" The German Shepherd looked at him, his eyes uncertain, but something in his gaze shifted. He stepped toward Ethan, cautiously sniffing the air around him, taking in the familiar scent of the vest. For a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw something in Max's eyes, a flash of recognition. Perhaps, or a glimpse of the dog he had once known. "That's it, boy," Ethan said softly, a hopeful grin spreading across his face. "You remember." With a deep breath, Ethan placed the vest on the ground in front of the dog. Max sniffed it more intently now, his tail giving a small, tentative wag. Ethan knelt beside him, extending his hand. "Come on, old friend," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's just like before." For a moment, Max hesitated. Then, slowly, he took a step forward, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of the battlefield, of their shared experiences. Ethan watched closely, feeling his heart race. It wasn't just about the vest, it was about their shared history. The connection that had been severed and was now slowly being rebuilt. As the dog continued to sniff, Ethan couldn't help but remember the times in the field. The bond they had forged over countless missions. They had been inseparable then, partners in every sense of the word. Now, in this quiet yard in Tucson, it was as though the past was coming alive once more. With a deep, steadying breath, Ethan stood and took a few steps back. "Max, let's go for a walk." he said softly, not wanting to rush the moment. "We've got all the time in the world. And we'll take it slow." The German Shepherd turned his head toward him, then cautiously followed. Ethan reached down and attached the leash, feeling a wave of anticipation as he led Max toward the front door. The world outside seemed to await them, just like it had years ago. The walk through the quiet streets of Tucson felt like a new beginning. Max was still skittish, still hesitant, but he was walking with Ethan, side by side. And for Ethan, that was all that mattered. They didn't need to rush. They didn't need to pretend things were the same. They only needed to be together, taking the next step forward. As they walked, Ethan spoke softly to Max, telling him stories from their time together. From the days when everything seemed simpler, when they were partners fighting side by side. And though the dog didn't respond, Ethan could sense the faintest change in the air. There was something in Max, a flicker of recognition, a spark that hadn't been there before. Later, back at the house, Ethan felt something stir within him. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but they were on the right path now. Max had made progress, and so had he. The trauma they both carried was not something that could be erased, but it could be managed. It could be faced together. That night, as Max lay down beside him, Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was enough. "We'll get through this, Max," Ethan whispered, his voice soft but full of conviction. "We'll do it together." And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed it. Max had found his way back to him, and now they would face the world as they always had, together. As partners once more. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. No matter what came next, Ethan Walker and Max would face it side by side.